The phone call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in October. I remember the time because I'd just turned off the late news and was reaching for my reading glasses on the nightstand. My daughter's name lit up the screen, and before I even said hello, I heard her breathing. That particular kind of breathing where someone is trying very hard not to fall apart. Mom. Just that. One word. Where are you? The parking garage. The one near the river. Level 3. A long pause. He changed the locks, Mom. Tate changed the locks. Mom. Tate changed the locks. And his father fired me this afternoon. I have the baby. I have one bag. I don't know where to go. I was already pulling on the jeans I'd folded over the chair. Stay in the car. Lock the doors. Keep the baby warm. I'm coming. Mom, it's an hour and a half. I know how far it is. Stay there. I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't sit down on the edge of the bed and put my face in my hands the way a woman in a movie would. I went to the closet, took down the leather portfolio I'd kept on the top shelf for 7 years, and ran my thumb across the embossed initials on the cover. Then I put on my coat, grabbed my keys, and drove. My name is Marjorie. I'm 63 years old. I live in a modest brick colonial in a town outside Cleveland that nobody's heard of, and for the last 14 years I've let a man named Curtis Halverson believe he owned 3 orthodontic clinics in 3 different counties. He didn't. He never did. He worked for me. He just didn't know it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The drive to that parking garage was the longest hour and a half of my life. Not because I was scared. I was past scared. I was somewhere colder than scared, somewhere methodical. I was already making lists in my head: bank, attorney, the locksmith who owed me a favor, the file cabinet in the storage unit in Akron that nobody knew about. By the time I pulled into level 3 and saw my daughter's silver Honda parked under a flickering fluorescent, I had the next 2 weeks mapped out in my mind. She was sitting in the driver's seat with the baby asleep in the car seat behind her. Her face was puffy. She'd been crying for hours. She put a blanket over the baby. My granddaughter, 7 months old, named Junie after my mother, and she had one hand resting on the blanket like she was checking the baby's breathing every few seconds. I knocked on the window. She unlocked the doors. Come on, sweetheart. Get out. Get the baby. I can drive, Mom. You're not driving anywhere tonight. Get the baby. Leave your car. She didn't argue. That's how I knew how bad it was. My daughter, my stubborn, brilliant, sharp-as-a-knife daughter, didn't argue with me. She unbuckled Junie, lifted her against her shoulder, grabbed the duffel bag from the passenger seat, and followed me to my Buick. I buckled Junie into the spare car seat I kept in my back seat. I kept a car seat in my back seat the way some women keep an umbrella in the trunk. Just in case. When we were back on the highway, heading home, I said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Don't skip anything." She started slow. Then it came out in a rush. Her father-in-law, Curtis, had called her into his office that morning. He told her that her position as practice manager at the flagship clinic was no longer viable. He used those words. No longer viable. He said the family had decided to restructure and that her services were no longer required. He gave her a check for 2 weeks severance and told her she had until end of business to clear her desk. She'd been working there for 6 years. She'd built the patient retention system. She'd negotiated the vendor contracts. She'd been the one who fired the embezzling office manager 3 years ago and saved them $140,000. None of that mattered. He told her, and I'm quoting because she repeated it to me 3 times, "The family has decided that your priorities have shifted since the baby. We need someone fully committed." She'd driven home shaking. When she got there, her key didn't work. She rang the doorbell. Tate. My son-in-law, her husband of 4 years, opened the door 6 inches with the chain on. "You can't be here right now, Cass. My dad explained everything. We need some space. I'll have your things sent to your mother's." That was it. That was the conversation. He closed the door. She stood on the porch holding their daughter while a neighbor walked a golden retriever past the mailbox and pretended not to notice. She drove to the parking garage because she didn't know what else to do. She didn't want to come straight to me without thinking first. She sat there for 4 hours trying to figure out how to tell me without it being the worst night of my life. She called her sister first. Her sister didn't pick up. She's in Seattle, 3 hours behind, but still. She called her best friend from college. The friend's husband answered and said she was at her book club. So Cassidy sat in a parking garage with her baby and finally called her mother. I let her tell the whole thing without interrupting. Then I said, "Did you sign anything today? Anything Curtis put in front of you?" "No, he had a separation agreement. I told him I'd take it to a lawyer." "Good girl." "Mom, what am I going to do?" "I have $1,100 in my checking account. My name's not on the house. The car is in Tate's name because his dad bought it for us when Junie was born. I have nothing." I kept my eyes on the road. "Sweetheart, you have everything. You just don't know it yet." She didn't ask what I meant. She was too tired. She put her head against the cold window and closed her eyes, and I drove the rest of the way in silence, with my granddaughter making little sleeping noises in the back seat and my hand so steady on the wheel that I almost frightened myself. We got home a little after 2 in the morning. I put Cassidy in the guest room with the baby. I gave her one of my flannel nightgowns. I made her drink a glass of water and take a melatonin. I sat with her until she fell asleep, with Junie tucked into the crook of her arm. Then I went downstairs to the kitchen, made a pot of coffee, opened the leather portfolio, and started reading. The portfolio held everything. The original incorporation documents from 2011, when my late husband Roland and I had quietly purchased the 3 commercial buildings in 3 small Ohio cities. The trust paperwork showing that the buildings, the land underneath them, and the dental equipment financing arrangements were owned by a holding company called Birch Point Holdings, LLC. The sole member of Birch Point Holdings was a trust. The sole beneficiary of the trust was me. And underneath all of that, the lease agreements with the tenant, Halverson Family Orthodontics, PC, that named Curtis Halverson as president and signatory. Curtis didn't own those buildings. He didn't own the equipment. He didn't own the practice management software, which Birch Point also held the licensing on. He owned the goodwill of the practice name, the patient relationships, and the dental school diploma on his wall. Everything else, the literal walls, the chairs, the x-ray machines, the computers, belonged to me. He had no idea. I should explain how that happened. Because the top question I got later, when the dust settled and Cassidy asked me to walk her through it, was the obvious one. How does a man run a business for 14 years and not know who owns the building he's standing in? The answer is, because he never asked, and because Roland set it up that way on purpose. Roland was an accountant, not a flashy one. A quiet, careful, patient man who used to say that anyone who tells you their business plan in the first 10 minutes of meeting you is trying to sell you something. In 1998, he'd done the books for a dentist named Stan Halverson, Curtis's father, when Stan was buying his first practice. Stan died in 2009. He left the practice and a mountain of debt to Curtis, who was 32 and arrogant and had no idea how to run a business. Curtis came to Roland in tears, asking what to do. Roland and I sat at our kitchen table and looked at the numbers and saw that the practice itself was sound. The debt was the buildings, and the buildings could be acquired for a song if someone had the cash. We had the cash. My mother had died the year before and left me $250,000 and a small farm in Pennsylvania I sold for another $200,000. Roland had been quietly saving for 30 years. We bought all 3 buildings through Birch Point, which we'd set up specifically because Roland did not trust Curtis Halverson. We then offered Curtis a long-term lease at a rate just slightly below market, with an option to buy at any time at a fair appraised price. He never exercised the option. He didn't even read it. Roland handled the lease renewals every 5 years, and Curtis just signed where the tabs were. The lease was always with Birchpoint Holdings LLC by its authorized representative, and that representative was Roland. After Roland died in 2018, the representative became a young attorney in Columbus named Pia Vandermeer, who I'd known since she was a child because her mother was my best friend in graduate school. Pia had been signing the lease renewals on my behalf for 7 years. Curtis had never once asked who Birchpoint Holdings was. He thought it was a real estate company. He told Cassidy more than once that he was in negotiations to buy his buildings from some investment firm out of Pittsburgh. He'd been lying for years, telling his country club friends he owned the real estate too. He'd even taken out a personal line of credit, I learned later, using a forged document claiming he owned the flagship building outright. That was the part that turned everything from a family disgrace into a federal matter. But I didn't know that yet. At 2 a.m, sitting at my kitchen table with the coffee going cold, I only knew what I'd known for years, that Curtis Halverson was a man who got handed a fortune by his father and assumed he'd earned it. I made my first call at 6 a.m. I called Pia. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what had happened. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Marjorie, are you ready to do this? I've been ready for 14 years. Give me the day. I'll have the termination notices drafted by 5. I called the bank next at 8. I'd kept a relationship with a personal banker named Doreen at a small institution in Mentor for 20 years. I asked Doreen to pull every record of any account at her bank associated with Cassidy's Social Security number. Doreen knew not to ask why. She called me back at 9:40 with a list that made my hands shake. There were 4 credit cards in Cassidy's name that she had not opened. There was a line of credit for $42,000 taken out in 2023. There was a car loan in her name for a Lexus she had never owned. The total exposure was $163,000 in debt, and Cassidy's credit score, which had been over 800 when she got married, was now 498. I sat at the kitchen table with the phone in my hand, and I had to breathe through my nose for a minute. Then I called Pia back. "Get me a forensic accountant. The good one. The woman in Cincinnati." On it. By the time Cassidy came downstairs that morning in my flannel nightgown with Junie on her hip, I had made 11 phone calls and Pia had drafted 3 documents. Cassidy didn't ask what I'd been doing. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table and looked at me with eyes that were swollen almost shut. "Mom," she said quietly, "I think I have to call CPS." "Why?" "Because last night, when I was banging on the door, Tate had Junie inside. He had her in the house when he wouldn't let me in. She was crying. I could hear her crying through the door for almost 10 minutes before he opened it. He kept a 7-month-old baby on the other side of a locked door from her mother who was standing on the porch in November. Mom, that's not okay." "No, sweetheart, it's not okay." "No, sweetheart, it's not okay. We're going to document that. We're going to file it properly. But we have to do it the right way, with a lawyer, so it doesn't look like a custody tactic. Eat something. Then we're going to make a plan." She ate 2 pieces of toast. I held Junie while she ate. Junie put her small hand against my cheek and pulled my reading glasses crooked, and I almost broke right there, but I didn't. I want to say something about Curtis's wife. Her name was Delphine. The comments people make about my daughter's story always ask about the mother-in-law, and the truth is, Delphine wasn't innocent, but she wasn't a villain. She was a woman who'd been married to Curtis Halverson for 36 years, and had spent most of those years pretending not to see things. She'd had a stroke in 2022 and had been mostly homebound ever since. She'd liked Cassidy. I'm sure she didn't know what Curtis was doing, but she also didn't ask. There's a kind of complicity in not asking, and I'd watched it ruin women my whole life. I made a note to call her myself when the time came, not to threaten her. To tell her woman to woman what her husband and her son had done. The forensic accountant's name was Honoria. She arrived at my house on Thursday morning with 2 assistants and a rolling cart of equipment. I'd cleared out my dining room. By Friday evening, they'd found the rest of it. Invoices to vendors that never existed. Payroll being run through a shell company in Delaware that Curtis controlled. And this was the one that made Pia actually swear out loud. A pattern of charging cosmetic procedures to Cassidy's stolen credit cards and writing them off the books as business expenses. Curtis had been laundering his personal spending through fraud on his daughter-in-law's identity for at least 3 years. On Friday night, Pia came over for dinner. I made a pot of chili. Cassidy fed Junie sweet potato out of a little glass jar. We sat at the kitchen table afterward, with Junie asleep on a blanket on the floor, and Pia laid out the plan. Monday morning, she said, I'm going to drive to Curtis's flagship clinic. I'm going to walk into his office at 9 a.m. with a notarized termination of lease effective in 90 days on all 3 properties. I'm going to inform him that Birch Point Holdings will not be renewing under any terms. I'm going to hand him a separate notice that the practice management software licensing is also being terminated, effective in 30 days. I'm going to hand him a third notice that the dental equipment financed through Birch Point must be returned or purchased at appraised value, also within 90 days. Cassidy stared at her. Mom owns the equipment too? Your mom owns essentially everything Curtis touches except his car and his diploma. Cassidy looked at me. Why didn't you tell me? I'd thought about this answer for years. I'd known the day might come when I'd have to give it. Because, sweetheart, when you married Tate, I didn't know what kind of man his family was. Roland had always said, and I quote, let them think they own it. If they ever turn out to be decent people, we'll deed it over as a wedding present. If they turn out to be the other kind, we'll have leverage. And we never did know for sure. Tate seemed nice enough. Curtis was loud and full of himself, but I told myself that wasn't a crime. So we waited, and we watched. And I am so sorry that we waited this long. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Daddy planned for this. Your father planned for everything. She started to cry, but it was a different kind of crying than the night before. Pia got up and put on the kettle. Pia also explained what was going to happen with the criminal side of it. She'd already, with my permission, contacted a former colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud were federal crimes. The FBI was going to want to talk to Cassidy, probably as early as the following week. Cassidy was going to need to file a police report, file affidavits with all 4 credit card companies, and put a fraud alert on her credit. Pia would coordinate it. The IRS was also going to be very interested in the Delaware shell company. Curtis was looking at, conservatively, 20 to 40 years in federal prison. What about Tate? Cassidy asked. Her voice was very small. Pia looked at me before she answered. Tate is on the LLC paperwork for the Delaware shell. He signed it. Whether he understood what he was signing is between him and his attorney. But yes, Tate is exposed. Cassidy nodded slowly. She didn't ask any more questions that night. On Saturday, I called Delphine, Curtis's wife. I drove to her house in the afternoon, and her caretaker let me in. Delphine was in the sunroom in a wheelchair, her left hand curled in her lap. A crossword puzzle she couldn't quite finish on a tray in front of her. She brightened when she saw me, and then her face fell, because she could tell from my expression that I wasn't there for a visit. I sat down across from her and I told her, in the plainest words I had, what her husband and her son had done to my daughter. I told her about the firing and the locks and the 4 credit cards and the federal charges that were coming. I told her about Cassidy in a parking garage at midnight with a 7-month-old baby and 1 bag. Delphine cried. She cried for a long time. Then she said, very slowly, with the slur the stroke had left her with, I think I knew. I think I didn't want to know. I know, Delphine. Will you let me see my granddaughter? I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about all the women I'd known who'd been punished for what their husbands did. I thought about how Junie would grow up, and who would tell her the family story, and what kind of story I wanted her to inherit. Yes, I said. When the legal pieces are done. You'll see her. You'll see her often. But Curtis won't, and Tate won't until Junie is old enough to decide for herself. She nodded. She reached for my hand with her good one and squeezed. Monday morning, Pia drove to Curtis's flagship clinic. She walked into his office at 9 a.m. exactly. She handed him the 3 notices. She told him that Birchpoint Holdings would not be entertaining any negotiations, and that any communication from this point forward needed to go through her office. Cassidy and I waited at my kitchen table. The call from Pia came at 9:23. Pia's voice was calm. He went white. He kept saying there had to be a mistake. He asked who Birchpoint was. I told him. He sat down. He didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then he asked if he could call you. I told him you'd be in touch when you were ready. He called him you'd be in touch when you were ready. He called me at 10:15. I let it go to voicemail. He called 12 more times that day. I listened to the first voicemail. He was apologetic and reasonable and called me Margie, which nobody ever has called me, and asked if we could have a conversation, woman to woman, mother to mother. I deleted it. I didn't listen to the others. He sent his attorney to my house on Tuesday. I made the attorney wait on the porch in the rain for 20 minutes while I finished a phone call with Honoria. Then I opened the door and told him, politely, that all communication needed to go through Pia and closed the door before he could say a word. By Wednesday, word had spread. By Friday, 2 of Curtis's associate orthodontists had called Pia directly to ask about coming to work for a new practice. Pia took their numbers. I'm going to skip ahead now because the legal part lasted almost 2 years and most of it was paperwork. Curtis was indicted on 14 counts in March. He pled out in September of the following year and got 19 years. Tate took a plea in exchange for testimony against his father and got 4 years and full restitution. Cassidy's credit was restored. The $163,000 in fraudulent debt was wiped. She received, through the civil settlement, $840,000, which is what the forensic accountant calculated Curtis had stolen from her through identity theft plus damages. The 3 buildings, the equipment, the practice management software, all of it now belongs to Cassidy, not to me. I transferred Birchpoint Holdings into her name the week after the indictment. I told Pia I'd waited 14 years to do that, and I wasn't waiting another day. Cassidy hired 2 of Curtis's old associate orthodontists. She hired a 3rd from a practice in Toledo. She runs all 3 clinics now under a new name. June Bird Orthodontics for our girl. She's good at it. She was always going to be good at it. The patient retention numbers in the first year were up 19%. The staff loves her. She raised everyone's pay 6% the day she took over, because she knew from her years as practice manager exactly how underpaid the hygienists had been. Delphine sees Junie every other Sunday. I drive her over. Delphine and I have become, in a strange way, friends. We don't talk about Curtis. We talk about Junie, and about the garden Delphine used to keep, and about a trip to Charleston we keep saying we'll take when she's strong enough. Tate writes letters from prison. Cassidy reads them. She hasn't written back. I don't know if she will. That's not my decision to make. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I'll stop. About a year after the indictment, Cassidy was at my house for Sunday dinner. Junie was almost 2 by then. Walking, getting into everything. After dinner, I was in the kitchen, and Cassidy came in and sat on a stool at the island and watched me dry the dishes. Mom. Yeah, sweetheart. What if I called someone else that night? What if my sister had picked up? What if I'd gone to a hotel? I put down the dish towel. You wouldn't have. You called me because you knew, on some level, that I'd been waiting. You didn't know what I was waiting for, but you knew I'd been waiting. She thought about that. Then she said, I want Junie to know all of it, when she's old enough. She will. And Mom, I want her to know that you didn't save me. That I called you and you handed me the tools, but I did the work. I want her to grow up knowing her mother fought. I started to cry then, finally. after almost 2 years of not crying about any of it. "She'll know," I said. "I'll make sure she knows." Junie came toddling in then in her little overalls, holding a wooden block. She held it up to me like an offering. I took the block. I knelt down on my old knees and stacked it on top of another block on the kitchen floor. She knocked the tower over. She laughed. She picked up the blocks and handed them back. "We built it up." She knocked it down. "We built it up." She knocked it down. "We built it up again." That's the part nobody tells you about being a mother or a grandmother. You build the tower, you hand it over, they knock it down, and you build it again and again. And every time you build it, it gets a little stronger because the blocks have been in more hands, and the hands have learned what they're doing, and the foundation isn't just yours anymore. It's hers now, the whole thing. The buildings, the practice, the daughter, the granddaughter, the story. I'm just the woman who kept the deeds in a portfolio on the top shelf of her closet for 14 years, waiting to see what kind of men her son-in-law and his father turned out to be. Now I know, and so does Junie's mother. And someday, when she's old enough to understand, so will Junie. That's the whole story. That's what my daughter called me from a parking garage to tell me, even though she didn't know she was telling me. She thought she was telling me her life was over. She was telling me it was just beginning. I've been sitting with this story for a long time now, and the older I get, the more I believe that nothing in a life is ever truly hidden. Things just wait. Curtis spent 14 years strutting through clinics that weren't his, signing checks against equipment he didn't own, telling his country club friends he was a self-made man. He didn't ask the obvious question. He didn't read the lease. He assumed, because he'd always been the loudest man in any room, that the room belonged to him. That's not a crime. But what he did to my daughter, using her social security number, hollowing out her credit, firing her for the sin of becoming a mother that grew straight out of the same soil. A man who never asks who really owns a thing is a man who eventually believes he can take whatever he wants. The cause and the consequence sat in the same body for 14 years before they finally met each other in a federal courtroom. I don't think there are mystical forces in the world. I think there are choices made every day that pile up the way dishes pile up in a sink. Roland taught me that. He'd say, give a person enough time and enough rope, and they'll show you exactly who they are. Curtis showed us. Tate showed us. And when the night came that my daughter was sitting in a parking garage with a baby asleep in the back seat, the choices Roland and I had made 14 years before were already waiting on the top shelf of my closet in a leather portfolio, patient as a stone. If I could give my granddaughter one inheritance besides the buildings and the practice, it would be this. Be the kind of person who reads what she signs. Be the kind of person who asks who really owns the building. Be patient when patience is the right tool, and be sharp when sharpness is. Don't confuse loud with strong. Loud men break things. Strong women rebuild them, sometimes quietly, over decades, and trusts and lease agreements and small acts of attention nobody notices until the day they matter. And be honest with the people you love. I waited too long to tell Cassidy what was on the top shelf of my closet. I told myself I was protecting her marriage. I was, in some small way, protecting Curtis from the consequences of being Curtis. That wasn't my job. My job was to give my daughter the tools and trust her to use them. She used them better than I ever could have. The tower goes up. Somebody knocks it down. You build it again. That's not philosophy. That's just what mothers do and what daughters learn and what granddaughters will someday teach their own.